Welcome to the third video of our follow-up study series, and today we're going to be digging into the question of how we got the Bible, and is the Bible trustworthy? The story of how we got the Bible is not a short one. It's not one that hasn't been contended by many skeptics over the course of history, and obviously in today's day there are still many skeptics around, but in my opinion, the Bible actually stands up to its criticisms and its skeptics more than any other ancient text. But I only have about 20 minutes here today, so we can't dig into all of the nuances of this question. You could spend hours on a YouTube rabbit hole looking into all of the intricacies of this question. But really today what I want it to be is just us laying a groundwork for us, just getting our foot in the door, and obviously we can dig into deeper studies on our own in the times to come, but today we're just going to lay a groundwork. So we're going to start with this question today. How did we get the Old Testament? How did the Old Testament come to be? With many ancient texts, they're passed through from generation to generation through what's called manuscripts, and manuscripts are just copies of the original text. So the original texts are written down, but over time those original texts get damaged. Think about any Bible that you've had for a couple years or maybe even a couple decades, and those papers are very worn down. They have a lot of underlines and a lot of highlights and a lot of little notes in there, but over time they get worn down, they get damaged, and at a certain point you can't even read out of that Bible anymore because it's been so worn down. And the same thing happens, or the same thing happened to those Old Testament texts. They were written down, but then over time they became unusable, unreadable. So they had to copy the text down on a new manuscript before it became unreadable. And that process would just repeat and repeat and repeat. And because of that process, we have the Old Testament as we know it today. But these copies that are written down of the original text are written with extreme precision. The Israelites held scripture in very high regard. Its preservation was something to be taken very seriously. There was a lot of careful effort and diligence put in to preserve these scriptures and pass them on to future generations, to pass them on to us. As I said earlier, the originals were written down, but over time they become damaged and soiled. And after several generations of use, the scriptures would be copied onto new manuscripts, and the process would just repeat. But this process was not as simple as just copy and paste, or just, in your spare time, just jot a couple words down. If one letter was missed, or if one letter was accidentally added, just one letter, the whole manuscript was destroyed. The whole manuscript was thrown away, and they would have to redo the whole process. I think about anytime I need to write an email. I can barely write an email without a typo. I can't even imagine writing down entire books of the Bible with that kind of precision. But the Israelites took that call very seriously, to write down the scriptures and pass them on to future generations. So that's a little bit about how the Old Testament was assembled. But can we trust the Old Testament? Can we place our trust and our faith in what we are reading today is exactly what the Old Testament authors wrote down centuries and centuries ago? Now, when it comes to the trustworthiness of ancient texts, two main questions are important. How close was the original text written in relation to the event? This is important so that the story can be recorded truthfully. And the second question is, how close is our oldest copy to the original? This is important because sometimes changes can occur over time when there's huge gaps between when the original was written and when our most oldest copy exists. And for a long time, there were actually lots of skeptics about the Old Testament text and the validity of it, because our most recent manuscripts, or our most recent copies, were from 900 AD. 900 AD is about 1,000 years removed from the actual events and the people of the Old Testament. This is a problem because it's hard to trust that someone is accurately recording the events when they're so far removed from them. And while this was a problem that the Old Testament text ran into, many ancient texts, if not all ancient texts, run into this same exact problem. Yet we trust all of those authors with little skepticism. We trust all those authors, and there's not too many critics for those authors as well. Many famous works, like the works of Aristotle, of Plato, and Homer, have huge gaps between our most recent copy and the original copy. Yet no one is, getting on YouTube and saying, oh man, like, don't trust in the work of Aristotle or Plato. No one is getting on these platforms and saying these things. But for the Old Testament, an important discovery was made not too long ago, in 1947, that would put many of our doubts to rest. So in 1947, a shepherd was herding his animals near the bottom of a low cliff, and there were some caves, and this shepherd just picked up a rock and just kind of threw it into the cave. Just why not, right? Instead of hearing this rock bounce off the side of the caves and then probably fall to the ground, he heard the sound of pottery shattering. And obviously, when you throw something into a cave and hear pottery shattering, you start to get curious, because that's not usually the sound that you would expect a rock to make when thrown into a cave. And he found all of these scrolls, which he then, took those scrolls and he brought them into Jerusalem and showed some archaeologists there. And then over the coming weeks, hundreds of people, hundreds of archaeologists went into that cave and the surrounding caves and discovered 200 scrolls and 40,000 fragments in 11 different caves in that area. And what they found in those scrolls was that every Old Testament book was represented except for the book of Esther. This young shepherd, what he discovered was the ancient Qumran library. And the Qumran people were people that existed about 200 BC, and they were unhappy with the religious practices of the day. So they moved into the desert where this library was found by this shepherd. These scrolls were about 1,000 years older than the best manuscripts that they had at the time. The Qumran library had manuscripts dating all the way back to 200 BC. But this also brings up this question. Did what we find in, the ancient Qumran library in the Dead Sea Scrolls, did that change any of the scriptures that we had been reading for centuries upon centuries? Fortunately, what they found was that these scrolls, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I mentioned, were almost identical to the manuscripts that they had been reading for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is crazy to think about how similar these two manuscripts were, being separated by such a long period of time. But it's thanks to the work of the people that copied down all of the Old Testament texts letter for letter, word for word. In the Old Testament, there's about 500,000 letters. And what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls were that only about 169 of those letters were called into question when compared to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what that means is that there's a 99.97% agreement between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the manuscripts that they had dating back to 900 AD, the manuscripts that they had been reading for hundreds and hundreds of years. They had 99.97% agreement. And so for me, the Old Testament is something that I can confidently place my trust in, knowing that exactly what the Old Testament authors wrote is what I'm reading today. We can easily trust in the fact that we're reading what all the Old Testament authors wrote thousands and thousands of years ago, thanks to the work of the teachers of the law, of the scribes, of the Masoretes, who did such amazing work in copying down all those texts with extreme accuracy and precision. But what about the New Testament, right? So let's move on to the New Testament now. How did the New Testament come to be, and is the New Testament trustworthy? Can we trust the New Testament in the same way that we trust the Old Testament? And the New Testament was assembled in a very similar way that the Old Testament was. The authors wrote down the original copies, and then as those copies got old, they would write down new copies. The only difference was that there are many, many, many more copies of the New Testament that were written closer to the original date, because they wanted to spread the gospel to all the churches that they had spreading all across the known world at that time. So to a certain extent, the New Testament is even more reliable than the Old Testament because we have so many copies of it. And another important aspect of the trustworthiness of the New Testament is how close the events were written down in relation to the actual events itself. The events of the New Testament ended around 62 AD. All of the New Testament was done being written just 7 years later in 69 AD, a much smaller gap than many other ancient works. The tenets of Buddhism were written down hundreds of years later. But the works, or rather, the books of the New Testament were written in completion just 7 years after all of the events occurred. And while none of the original copies of the New Testament still exist today, which is also true for every other ancient work, we have no original copies of any ancient work. All we have is manuscripts. The copies that we do have are so close to the original copy that we can have complete faith in them. The copies of the New Testament were circulated and read to all of the churches in the first century, which for us means that we have so many copies to pull from, to compare, and say that what we are reading today is exactly what the authors of the New Testament wrote down about 2,000 years ago. We have nearly 6,000 New Testament manuscripts that we can use to confirm the reliability of the New Testament. The work of Aristotle has just 5 copies. That's it. Just 5 copies. Not 5,000, not 500, not 50. Just 5 copies. And yet there's, as I said earlier, there are very few critics of Aristotle. I think the New Testament is something that we can comfortably place our hope in, knowing that we have so many manuscripts, that the events were written down so close to the actual events happening, that we can have complete trust and faith that what the New Testament authors wrote down is what we are reading today in our Bibles. Overall, the New Testament and the Old Testament are very easy to place our trust in due to the work of the many groups of people who did diligent work in copying, preserving, and passing on the ancient scriptures to us. So let's close out with just one final question today that I think is important to hit on, and it's this. Is Jesus a myth? Since Jesus' death, there has been lots of contention on whether he was a real person or not. So I thought we could hit that question head on today. However, today it's hard to find a respectable scholar that denies the existence of Jesus. There's almost universal agreement at the bare minimum that Jesus was a real person living in the area of Palestine in the first century. Even atheists affirm the existence of Jesus. H.G. Wells is a 20th century English writer and a known atheist, and he said this. He said, "I am a historian. I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history." Jesus' existence is something that's affirmed by both biblical and non-biblical sources of the first century. Samaritan historian Thallus wrote as early as 52 AD about Christ, trying to give a natural explanation for the darkness that occurred in the middle of the day during Jesus' crucifixion. There was also a Roman historian, Tacitus, who wrote about Jesus in 112 AD. He discussed Jesus in the annals of imperial Rome, and he was discussing how Nero persecuted the believers in Jesus and mentioned that Jesus had been executed by Pontius Pilate. At the end of the day, atheists and Christians can actually agree on one thing, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person that lived in the first century. Whether he was Jesus the Messiah or just Jesus the carpenter from Nazareth, that is obviously still being debated today. But we can all agree that Jesus was a real person. So in closing, I hope today was informative to you in knowing where the Bible is coming from, and that we can place our trust and our faith and our hope in Scripture. And I hope that your faith has been built, knowing that the Bible is something that we can place our complete confidence in. That's all we have for now, and we'll see you on our next video.